Cuba is suffering now the worst economic crisis since the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the whole socialist bloc disappeared. We are witnessing now a repetition of what happened 30 years ago. And the current crisis is becoming close to the situation of the crisis of the 1990s. At the same time that this is happening in Cuba, and for a long period, both China and Vietnam have been growing at some of the highest growth rates in the world. China definitely, and Vietnam among the top. And China is the largest world economy after the United States. So, I mean, how can you explain this? That a socialist country like Cuba is a disaster, and on the other hand, you have successful economies in these two Asian countries. All what I am going to do, and this is very important, is based on statistics from the three countries. In a few cases, I use international data from the United Nations, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, but essentially these are statistics, official statistics. I am going to give you 4 examples. I can give you 100, but 4 examples which I think are representative. The first one is that in the period from 2016 to 2020, the Cuban economy declined, didn't grow, declined at a rate of minus 1.2%. At the same time, the Chinese economy and the Vietnamese economy grew about 6%. So that means that the Chinese and the Vietnamese economy increased 600 times more than Cuba. It's so incomprehensible. Second example, in 2020, inflation, which is a major problem in the world today, no? So the rate of China was 2.5%. The United States today is more than 8%. And in Vietnam, it was about 3%. In Cuba, it was close to 19%, but that was in 2020. The following year, last year, 2021, because of the introduction of the so-called monetary unification, the conversion of the two monetary units that Cuba had, inflation, according to official statistics, was 400%. Third, industrial output, and this is an important indicator of the economy. And so in the period from 1989, and I use that again because this is the eve of the huge crisis of the 1990s, and 2020, industrial output in Cuba decreased by 46%, it's almost half. So we call that deindustrialization. That's what happened in Cuba. Now, what happened in China? China increased 157 points, and Vietnam 57 points. So it's like 4 times better and twice as better. But this is not limited to economic data. I am finding that this is true also of most socialist indicators. For instance, Cuba is seen in the world as world medical power. Well, the maternal mortality rate in Cuba in 2021 was 177 per 100 children born alive. That put Cuba back to the level of the 1940s. What is the rate in China? The rate in China is 18 versus 177, and in Vietnam, it is 46. So for 60 years, I have been working on the Cuban economy, publishing on the Cuban economy, and everything doesn't work. I mean, they have changed policies like a dozen times, but basically, this centrally planned economy continues, and this is a major problem. Raúl Castro reforms, there was a lot of hope that he would be moving towards something like China and Vietnam, and the reforms were market-oriented, but they were too slow. There were too many regulations. There were zigzags in policy. And there was actually a counter-reform or at least a stagnation in 2016. And therefore, these reforms didn't work. Not only the economy did not increase, but actually you have a decrease. I forgot to say that in the year 2020, the economy, because I gave you just an average of 5 years, the economy in 2020 decreased almost 11%. 11%. That's the highest decline in the Cuban economy since 1993. Your question, I mean, you have a very successful economies in the case of China, Vietnam, and you have a debacle in the case of Cuba. And I am going to compare, therefore, if I have a couple of minutes more, two economic models which exist in the socialist world. One is Cuba's central plan. It's called a command economy with predominance of state ownership of the mix of production and official reluctance to accept the important role of the market. And on the other hand, you have what we call a socialist market economy, which is a kind of a mixed economy. A mixed economy that is under an indicative plan, not a central plan. This is like a guidance for economic development in the long run. It's not a straitjacket, as in the case of Cuba. And the private sector is the predominant in charge of ownership of the mix of production. And of course, the market plays a key role. So there are two different things, two different animals completely. And that is the essential explanation why failure on the one hand and success on the other.
One of the most interesting historical points you make in the introduction of the book, and that is that when Cuba began its journey into a communist-led revolution, it did so in a far more economically developed state than either Vietnam or China. So we're talking about really 1961 when you adopt communism formally, even though in the late 1960, the economy was nationalized. 82% of the economy was in the hands of the government. So in 1959, 1960, 1961, Cuba was the second or the third most advanced country in Latin America. Yet Vietnam and China's adoption of capitalist reforms have provided for both palpable growth and perhaps most dramatically a greater share in that growth by average citizens. So how do you explain that? How do you explain that both Vietnam and China have managed this palpable growth and then the fact that the growth is shared by average citizens versus Cuba, where you have obviously neither growth nor a general sharing in the growth since the adoption of capitalist reforms in the early 90s?
This is a very important point in the book, because we are saying, okay, let's take the moment in which the revolution started in the three countries, that is, 1940s in China, Vietnam, and the end of the 50s in Cuba. So Cuba was here and Vietnam. So in order to do what they did, not only they have to match Cuba, but they have to surpass Cuba. So Cuba had an enormous advantage over these two countries that were considered underdeveloped. There were famines in China, particularly, in which millions of people died of hunger. So it's not that these countries started at the same point. It's that they have to close the gap and go beyond that gap. Now, I knew, because it has been well documented, that China, Vietnam have higher economic growth than Cuba. So this is not a surprise. Perhaps not to the degree that I am showing in the book with a lot of statistical data, because I am not using economic growth, but using many other macroeconomic. But what is surprising is that this is happening also in the social realm, in the social arena, and particularly on Social Security. It's a theme that I have worked for 60 years. It's also called social protection. That is like pensions, healthcare, social assistance, etc. So what I found in the book is that China and Vietnam have progressed beyond Cuba on those indicators of social security. And how do I do this in the book? I use 5 fundamental principles from the International Labor Organization, social security principles that have been ratified by most countries in the world, including Cuba. And which are those 5 principles? The first one is that there should be, these are ideal, of course, there should be universal coverage of the total population in health. There should be also total coverage of the labor force on pensions. And there should be coverage of the needy. The second principle is benefit sufficiency or adequacy. That means that pensions should be sufficient to support standards of living after retirement. Healthcare, there should be access, but also fair quality of healthcare. And the benefit that you receive by social assistance should be a minimum, so that it is above the poverty line. So let me give you a couple of examples. I estimated, based on official statistics, the average pension of Cuba, China, and Vietnam. And the pension of China is 26 times the average pension of Cuba. 26 times. And the pension of Vietnam is 10 times. In terms of social assistance, one of the most important goals of this tool is to reduce or eliminate poverty. Well, China have reduced poverty to 0.6%. Vietnam has reduced poverty to 2%. We didn't have data on poverty incidence in Cuba because in all the years of the revolution never had published, but there is a Cuban expert that came to the United States and gave a lecture. I'm not going to say the name, it's cited in the book, but not here. And she said, and I have seen that in another publication of hers, that the poverty incidence in Cuba is between 25 and 30%. We knew that poverty has increased because of a series of surrogate indicators. But for the first time, we have a figure, and you can see the difference between the two countries is enormous. Okay,